Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a very complex topic that's been generating a lot of discussion recently, and that is the potential outcomes of getting rid of the U.S. Department of Education. You might have heard people like Elon Musk talking about this, advocating for just completely doing away with it. So we're going to really get into, what are the arguments for and against it. We're also going to be talking about this movement that's been going on towards what's being called patriotic education and what effects that might have on what's actually being taught in schools. And to get a good handle on all this, we're going to compare the American system with how they do things over in Denmark, which offers a really different approach. So to start off, I think it's really important to understand what the Department of Education in the United States actually does. Like, what is its role, and why is its existence even being questioned in the first place?
Well, the Department of Education, it kind of wears a lot of different hats. One of its main jobs is giving out money to schools all across the country. The idea is to make things more fair because, different places have different amounts of money locally. This support from the federal government is really, really important for schools in areas that aren't as wealthy, places that would have a tough time providing basic resources for their students without that extra help. And then you also have the department, it sets up and watches over all sorts of policies about education. They set kind of like the big guidelines and they make sure that schools are following laws about civil rights. This is super important for protecting groups who've been marginalized, and making sure that everybody has the same chance to get an education, no matter who they are or what their background is. Another thing they do that's really important is collecting data and doing research. So they gather all this information about different parts of education and then they analyze it so they can make smart decisions about policies and design reforms that will actually help students do better. Having all this data lets them figure out, which areas need work and come up with solutions that are specifically targeted to fix those problems.
Mm.
And then finally, they act as an advocate for making sure education is equitable. So through different programs, they try to fix those systemic disparities that can make inequality worse. That advocacy role is critical to making sure that all students have a fair chance to succeed, no matter, their background, their socioeconomic status, or any other thing that might be standing in the way of them getting a quality education.
So it sounds like the department plays a big role in the American education system, but it's definitely not without its critics. So what are some of the main points people make against it? And what are some of the flaws they see in how it works right now?
Yeah, a lot of the criticisms you hear, they center around a few things. People worry about the bureaucracy not being efficient, they worry about too much control being in one place, and they worry about education getting more and more political. The people who criticize it, they say the department has all this bureaucracy, so it's not efficient in how it spends money, and it makes it hard to actually put reforms into place that are needed. They think that the structure is just too complicated with too many layers of administration, and that creates a lot of unnecessary red tape. Another thing people don't agree on is how much control the federal government should have versus how much control local communities should have. Some people want strong national standards and oversight, to guarantee things are fair and the quality is good. But others say that if you have too much control in one place, it stifles innovation at the local level, and it doesn't work because different communities have different needs. They think that the people in charge locally are in a much better position to understand the specific problems in their communities when it comes to education, and they can respond to those problems better. And then the thing that really pushes people to want to get rid of the department completely is the idea that education is becoming way too political. Critics say that the department is getting caught up in all these political battles, and they might end up supporting certain types of curricula that favor one ideology over another. And this idea that things are getting too political makes people want to give more control to local communities. They think that individual states or even school districts should have the power to decide what they want to teach and what their priorities are without the federal government getting involved.
So let's shift gears a bit now and talk about what the people who support getting rid of the Department of Education have to say. What are the benefits they see in doing this? And which parts of how things work now do they think are hurting the American education system?
The people who want to abolish the department, they really focus on a few key points. They think that getting rid of it would give more power back to the states and local communities, and they think it would reduce bureaucracy, and it would give schools more flexibility to create their own approaches to education. They argue that if we shifted all that control to the state and local governments, then education would be better able to meet the needs of those specific communities. They'd be more in tune with culture, the economy, and the social needs of their particular areas. They believe that doing things locally would make schools much more responsive to what the community wants, and that it would allow them to come up with really targeted solutions. And they also argue that getting rid of the department would eliminate a whole bunch of bureaucracy at the federal level, which would streamline how education is run and could even make it so that money is used more efficiently. And this streamlining, they say, would give power back to local leaders so they can make decisions faster and put policies into place that are more in line with what they need locally. They wouldn't be bogged down by all these federal regulations and oversight. And the last thing they bring up is that this would allow for more creativity in how people approach education. They think a system that isn't so centralized would encourage innovation because local authorities would be free to experiment with different ways of teaching, and they could create curricula that focus on the strengths and interests of their students. They believe that if you got rid of all the federal rules and the standardized tests, that schools could be way more creative in how they teach and how students learn, and that would lead to experiences that are more engaging and more effective.
So the main point they're making is that having local control would make things more efficient. It would allow schools to be more responsive to what their communities need, and it would ultimately lead to better outcomes for students. But like we talked about earlier, there are some big risks that come with getting rid of that federal framework. Let's talk about those potential risks, starting with how it might impact educational equity and how talent is developed across the country.
When you look at the arguments for local control and cutting down on bureaucracy, they do make sense, but you really have to think about the downsides too. One big worry is that if we get rid of the Department of Education, inequality could get even worse, and we could actually lose out on some amazing American talent. You see, if you don't have that federal oversight and you don't have those funding systems that are designed to level the playing field, then the differences that already exist when it comes to resources and opportunities in education, those could become even more pronounced. Schools in wealthy areas with more money from taxes and more access to private funding, they'd probably be able to keep doing what they're doing or even improve. But then you have schools in areas where they just don't have as many resources. They're often already struggling. And without that federal help, they'd face even bigger challenges when it comes to providing a quality education for their students. And this gap that gets wider and wider would have consequences for everybody, not just individual kids, but for the entire nation. When education becomes more unequal, it usually leads to more social and economic inequality, and that can create this cycle of disadvantage that becomes almost impossible to escape. And there's another thing. If you don't have those centralized programs that are meant to find and support gifted students, we might miss out on some really incredible talent. Think about it. You have all these talented kids in areas that don't have enough money for schools. They might not have the chance to take advanced classes or be part of enrichment programs or get the special help they need, and that could hold them back from reaching their full potential. We could end up with this talent drain where all these promising young people don't get the support they need to really thrive, and that would hurt the country as a whole because we wouldn't be taking full advantage of the intellectual gifts of all our citizens.
Yeah, it's a pretty worrying picture when you think about all the missed opportunities and how much worse inequality could get. And it seems like the risks aren't just about the gap between schools that have money and those that don't. We could be losing out on future innovators and leaders simply because no one recognized their potential and helped them develop it. Let's switch gears now and talk about what happens to the actual content of the curriculum when you don't have national oversight. What kind of concerns come up in that area?
Well, another big risk of getting rid of the Department of Education is that you might end up with a lot of extreme curricula and even more politicization of education. If everything was decentralized, individual states or districts would get to decide what they wanted to teach without any guidance or oversight from the national level. And that could lead to curricula that are driven by ideology and that put certain perspectives ahead of factual accuracy and critical thinking. You could end up with things like creationist theories being taught in science classes, or the downplaying or even distorting of important historical events like slavery or the oppression of Native Americans. You might even see biased accounts of historical figures or social movements. This kind of curriculum wouldn't just mislead students about basic scientific principles or historical realities. It would also make it harder for them to analyze things critically and really understand the world around them. And if you don't have a national framework to make sure things are consistent when it comes to curriculum content, you could end up with a situation where academic standards are all over the place, and it becomes hard to compare educational qualifications from different states. Imagine students graduating from different districts or states with vastly different levels of knowledge and skills. It would make it really hard for colleges and employers to know what those qualifications actually mean. And this variability in educational quality wouldn't just hurt students from certain areas, it would also make it harder for the US to compete globally in an economy that really needs a workforce that's highly skilled and knowledgeable.
It's a pretty troubling thought. This idea that you could end up with a patchwork of different educational experiences across the country, with some students getting a really rigorous fact-based education, while others are exposed to curricula that prioritize certain beliefs over accuracy. And we actually saw a real-world example of how this could happen with the push for patriotic education that we saw during the Trump administration. Can you talk a bit more about that and explain why it's relevant to our discussion here?
Yeah, that push for patriotic education during the Trump administration is a perfect example of how dangerous it can be to let ideology shape what's being taught in schools. This whole initiative was about promoting a very specific view of American history and American values, and it raised a lot of concerns about the possibility of rewriting history and silencing voices that disagreed. People who supported it said it was necessary to make people feel proud to be American and create a sense of unity. But critics worried that it could lead to glossing over the parts of our history that weren't so great, like slavery, Jim Crow, and how Native Americans were treated. A lot of the proposed curricula focused on a very idealized version of American history. They downplayed or left out a lot of the negative stuff. Critics argued that if you only teach students this kind of sanitized version of history, they're going to have an incomplete and maybe even misleading understanding of their own country's past. They warned that a distorted curriculum like that could actually make society more fragmented because it would reinforce ideological divisions and make it harder to have honest conversations about all the complexities of American history and what it means to be American. But it wasn't just about distorting history. Patriotic education also raised concerns about how it would affect civic engagement and the quality of public discourse overall. By pushing this one single uncritical view of how great America is, it could undermine people's ability to think for themselves, debate issues, consider different points of view, and really evaluate information in a critical way. Critics argued that if you narrow the scope of intellectual inquiry like that it could actually weaken our democratic institutions because it reduces our capacity for informed participation and thoughtful discussions about important public issues.
So taking away that federal oversight of education could have some really serious consequences. We could end up with a wider achievement gap we could miss out on, potential talent, and we could see the rise of curricula that value specific ideologies over factual accuracy. And the example of patriotic education shows just how real that threat is. But to get a broader perspective on all this, let's look at how another country does things. So let's talk about Denmark and how their education system works. How is it different from the American system? What are some of the key philosophical differences in how they approach education?
The Danish education system is a really interesting contrast to the decentralized American model. It shows how a centralized approach can actually work and how it can help to prioritize equity and national cohesion. While the United States really focuses on local control and letting communities make their own decisions, Denmark has gone with a system that's much more centralized, with consistent standards across the board and a strong commitment to making sure all students have equal opportunities. This difference in philosophy is really evident in every part of their education system, from how they fund schools to how they develop curriculum to how they train teachers. The Danish approach to education is really rooted in this idea that education is a fundamental right and that it's one of the most important building blocks of a just and fair society. They see education as a public good that's essential for people to grow and develop, to move up in society, and for the country to be successful. This commitment to giving all citizens a good quality education, no matter their background, is reflected in how they fund schools. They make sure that resources are distributed fairly across all regions and schools. And the Danish system is also really focused on creating a sense of national unity and developing shared values. They see education as a way to bring people together around a common purpose and to prepare students to be active citizens in a democratic society. Their curricula reflect this emphasis on shared values. They encourage critical thinking, tolerance, and respect for diversity, and they make sure that students have a common understanding of Danish history and culture. This idea of building a unified society through education is very different from what's happening in America, where we're seeing more and more fragmentation and ideological polarization in education.
So it seems like while the U.S. system puts a lot of emphasis on local control and autonomy, Denmark has chosen a more centralized approach, focusing on fairness and national unity. Let's dig into some specific areas where these differences are really clear. Let's start with funding. How does Denmark make sure that all schools have the resources they need to provide a quality education, and how does that compare to how things work in the United States?
If you want to address the issues with curriculum content, you have to find a way to balance things. You need to have some national guidelines and make sure everyone's getting a basic level of factual accuracy and critical thinking skills. But you also need to allow for some flexibility at the local level so they can adjust things to meet the needs and interests of their communities. One way to do this could be to develop national curriculum frameworks that outline the main learning objectives and the essential knowledge that students need to have in key subject areas. Things like science history and civics. These frameworks would have to be developed very carefully and transparently. You'd need input from teachers, subject matter experts, people from the communities. And they could serve as a guide for developing curricula at the local level. This way you can make sure that all students are learning the essential stuff, but you're still giving local communities the freedom to adapt things and include different perspectives. It's about finding that sweet spot where you're upholding high academic standards and sticking to the facts, but you're also respecting the diversity of different communities and their priorities when it comes to education.
That kind of framework could be a really good starting point for developing curricula. It allows for consistency, but also some flexibility. But to make any framework work, you need good teachers who can actually implement it effectively. How do we make sure that teachers are prepared to deliver high-quality instruction that meets the needs of all learners, especially in a system that's trying to be more equitable and accessible?
You're absolutely right. If you want to reform education successfully, you have to empower teachers. Teachers are the ones who are on the front lines in our schools. They're the ones who are interacting with students every day. Their knowledge, their skills, their dedication, it's all essential for creating learning experiences that are engaging and effective. So investing in really good teacher training programs, that's super important. We need to be providing opportunities for teachers to continue learning throughout their careers, and we need to create work environments that are supportive and encourage collaboration and innovation. All of that is crucial for building a strong and effective teaching force. And it's not just about training. We also need to make sure that teachers have a say in how curriculum standards and assessments are developed and put into practice. They're the ones who are in the classrooms every day, so they have a lot of expertise and firsthand experience that's incredibly valuable. Their perspectives should be respected and incorporated into policy decisions. If we value teachers and we give them a voice in how things are run, we can create an education system that's more responsive, an effective one that truly serves the needs of both students and educators.
Absolutely. Recognizing and valuing the role of teachers is essential for any kind of successful education reform. But beyond the nuts and bolts of reforming education, we also have to think about the bigger picture. What are the fundamental goals of education in the 21st century? What kind of citizens are we trying to shape? And how do we measure success in a way that goes beyond standardized tests, which often don't capture everything that students are learning and all the potential they have?
Those are really the big questions we need to be asking ourselves if we want to improve our education system. The world is changing so rapidly with all the advances in technology, globalization, and all the challenges we're facing as a society. We need to rethink what we're trying to accomplish with education. We need to make sure we're preparing students for the complex world they're going to be living in. Education shouldn't just be about acquiring knowledge and skills. It should also be about developing critical thinking, creativity, problem-solving skills, and the ability to keep learning throughout your life. We need to teach students how to be empathetic, how to be tolerant, and how to respect diversity. We need to prepare them to be engaged and responsible citizens in a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected. Education should nurture a love of learning, a sense of wonder, and the confidence to pursue their passions and make a positive impact on the world around them. These aren't just some lofty ideals. These are essential qualities that people and communities need to thrive in the 21st century.
These are goals that go way beyond just preparing students for the workforce. They're about developing well-rounded individuals who can think critically, solve problems creatively, and contribute to their communities and the world as a whole. But how do we actually put these goals into action and measure whether we're achieving them? How do we move past this narrow focus on standardized tests and embrace a more holistic view of what it means to be successful in education? How do we measure those essential skills and qualities you were talking about?
If we want to stop relying so heavily on standardized tests as the only measure of success in education, we need to really change how we think about things. We need to embrace a multifaceted approach that values a wide range of skills, knowledge, and dispositions. We could incorporate things like performance-based assessments, portfolio reviews, and student-led exhibitions. These methods can give us a much more complete picture of what students are learning and how they're growing compared to standardized tests alone. And we also need to recognize the importance of things like social emotional learning, civic engagement, and those 21st century skills like collaboration, communication, and critical thinking. These skills are essential for success in all areas of life, not just in school or at work, and they should be valued and assessed along with the more traditional academic knowledge. If we start thinking about educational success in a more holistic way, we can give students the tools and qualities they need to thrive in this complex and constantly changing world.
It sounds like we need to move away from this idea that there's one right way to do education. We have to recognize that students have different talents, different ways of learning, and different goals. How can we create learning environments that are really responsive to the individual needs of learners while still making sure that all students are being held to high standards and being prepared for success in life? How do we balance personalized learning with the need for shared expectations and rigorous academic standards?
It's definitely a challenge to create personalized learning experiences that are tailored to individual students while also maintaining high standards for everyone. But it's not impossible. It requires us to move away from the traditional teacher-centered model of instruction and adopt a more student-centered approach. In a student-centered model, learners have more control over their education, and they can pursue their interests within a framework of high expectations and support. Technology can be a really powerful tool for making personalized learning happen. It gives students access to all sorts of information, learning resources, and tools for collaboration that can really enhance their learning experience. Adaptive learning platforms, for example, can tailor the instruction to each student's specific needs, providing personalized feedback and support as they work their way through the curriculum. But we have to remember that technology is just a tool. It's not a magic solution. You still need skilled and dedicated teachers who can guide students through the learning process, provide individual support, and create a classroom culture that values inquiry and collaboration.
Technology can definitely be helpful, but it's really the human element, the educators who guide and inspire students, that's at the heart of effective learning. As we wrap up our deep dive into the complexities of education reform, it's clear that if we want to create an education system that's truly effective and equitable, it's going to take a lot of effort on multiple fronts. We have to rethink how we fund schools, revise curriculum standards, empower educators, and adopt a more holistic view of what success means in education. It's about instilling a love of learning, nurturing critical thinking skills, and preparing students to be engaged and responsible citizens in a world that's changing faster than ever.
You've summed it up perfectly. Transforming education isn't about finding quick fixes or just making minor adjustments to existing policies. It's about fundamentally rethinking what education is for and how we structure it so that it meets the needs of the 21st century. It's about creating learning environments that are engaging, fair, and empowering for every student. Environments where every student has the chance to reach their full potential and contribute to a better, more just society.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into a really important topic. We've explored the arguments for and against getting rid of the U.S. Department of Education. We've looked at the Danish model as a different way of doing things, and we've considered some possible paths for reform. The future of education is in our hands. As we've discussed, it's going to take all of us working together, policymakers, educators, communities, and everyone who cares about the well-being and success of future generations. We encourage you to keep thinking about these issues, engage in thoughtful conversations, and advocate for policies that support a vision of education that is fair, effective, and empowering for everyone.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.